Welcome back to Finweek Money Matters. One of the biggest challenges facing business owners and managers is around the ability to incentivize staff in an ethical manner. Often companies focus on short-term goals but damage their brand in the long run. So in his column this week in Finweek, Gavin Symanowitz uses the financial services sector as an example and makes some suggestions going forward. So joining us for this conversation, Gavin, of course, and Cynthia Schoeman, Managing Director at Ethics Monitor. Mark, let's just quickly start off with you because this is an ethical issue. You, of course, have to look at how you remunerate people that work under you as well. So something that you've had to deal with. What's your view on it right now?
Sure. I mean, so one of the things I find very interesting is the other day I got pulled over by the Metro cops doing an illegal turn into a road. And so I stick my hand up, guilty as sin.
There we go.
And so the guy pulls you over and he says, writing the ticket, and I see a car go past doing exactly the same thing I've just done. And I said, but what happened? Why doesn't he get a fine? And he says, no, there's nobody to stop the car. But I say, there's two more guys sitting in the back seat of the car. And he says, no, but they've already filled in their book. They've hit their target. My book's still got to be filled. So I've got to sit here. I can let as many people go past until I've finished with you, and then we can start again. And I said, but it's a dwarf system. If you want to finish your job, all three of you stop people, finish one book, and you'll be able to get through the ticket book. Mm-hmm. But this idea that the other two have done their job and kind of fob off and leave everybody else leave this one guy not able to punish the same infraction, it's a stupid incentive system, because the guy's incentivized to finish the book by the end of the day. They could have finished the book by the time I was by the time they'd finished with me. Mm-hmm. But instead of it, they've incentivized one person and two other people sit on the sidelines, allowing exactly the same infraction to go through. And I just think it's a poor example of the ethics of the way the JMPD operates, an example. Mm-hmm. And then I guess if you bring what Gavin touches on this week in terms of the insurance or financial services sector, it's an issue.
So Gavin, run us through kind of the story that you told in the article this week around incentivization in the financial sector.
Well, this was an example that I came across right early in my career when I was working at a life insurance company. And one of the brokers took a policy that should have been a single sum assured of 200,000 Rand and split it up into 20 separate policies, each of 10,000 Rand, presumably to spread the risk, and that's what he told the client. In actual fact, what he was doing was he was maximizing his own income, because the life insurance company was paying him an admin fee for every policy that he loaded on the system. So by splitting it up into 20 different policies, he was maximizing his income. He was getting 20 times the policy fee that he should have at the expense of the client.
So bottom line, let's take this into how this works in every business. What would you say are some of the best ways to incentivize staff?
Well, obviously you want to create incentives that align the business's objectives with the staff's objectives. So when the staff do well, the business does well, and they're both moving in the same direction. The problem comes in when businesses put in incentives that they think will drive the business forward, but actually create behavior or incentivize behavior that is at odds with the actual business's strategic objectives.
But couldn't you argue in that case, in the financial case you listed, that it's really just the employee sort of being innovative and finding a way to make money out of a system? So perhaps it's not the employer's fault, it's actually the employee just being quite...
But you should take out those loopholes. Ultimately, as a business, it's being detrimental, your incentivization scheme.
Exactly. I mean, it is dishonest behavior on the part of employees, and you can't excuse that. But at the same time, you're putting those incentives in place and allowing him to actually do it. So ideally what you want to do is create incentives that don't have those kind of temptations to employees to do unethical behavior, so that you do drive the behavior that you want in terms of driving the business
forward.
You've
got to avoid temptation, ultimately.
Exactly. Yeah.
How do you do this? I mean, because it seems that you can come up with an idea and then someone will find a loophole. And what's your experience of this?
I think there are two aspects to it that are really important. I mean, one is that from a leadership perspective, if you're putting an incentive in place, yes, of course, the intended outcome is always clear. But you've also got to consider the unintended outcome. We've got examples all over the show. And I think that leadership responsibility is crucial. But for me, where the gap also happens, and it speaks to your example very well, is that we focus on compliance rather than compliance and commitment. Mm-hmm. Do you know, it's all fine and well, you've ticked the box. Have you in fact achieved an equitable, a just, or an ethical outcome? And the answer was that wasn't even the goal. The goal was ticking the box. And certainly in my experience, I'm finding companies are very compliance focused. Have you ticked the box? And they're not taking that next step to say, but does this actually represent ethical behavior?
So they're actually lacking some vision in incentivizing their employees, or sort of a long-term strategy.
Yeah.
But I think the sustainability issue is there, because you talk to the customer issue then. So you're saying, well, yeah, you might make your money 10 times off this customer now, but you're not going to make it 100 times every year going forward, is because you're not protecting the customer there. I mean, how do you build the incentives that protect the customer and the guys that are building the businesses?
I think what you have to do is think through your incentive scheme very carefully. So the angle I took in the article was to say, actually, when you're designing an incentive scheme, try and think of all the ways that your employees can actually screw you out of the incentives, or how could they make the most money with the least amount of work using the incentive scheme and within the processes that you've actually set. So you almost have to put yourself in the mind of a dishonest employee, if you will, and think how they would actually apply the incentives that you've put in place in order to maximize their own benefit, not necessarily that of the company.
Sure, but that's an issue. It's easy to point fingers at the financial services sector, because I think whether it's an insurance broker or the CEO of a multinational bank, the incentives are built around me. They're not built around what's good for the organisation in the long run. It's take as much out of the organisation as I can in the short term. I mean, as a broader question, is that culture changing though? I mean, do you believe that companies are starting to realise that what's happened in the last 4 to 5 years is an issue of greed and the me culture that's permeated?
I'm certainly finding that there's a far greater awareness of the reputational value, of the brand equity value of having a sound ethical reputation, not just base level compliance, and that for me has over the years surfaced a huge amount, and in all fairness, I think it is thanks, if you want in a perverse way, to the ethical scandals that people are saying, listen, we've seen what happened, let's not go there. And so that for me, if you want ironically, has had this positive effect of making organizations much, much more aware.
What about the unintended consequences of changing incentivization schemes, for example, in the financial sector, where it actually could be detrimental to a bank, for example, an investment bank, where you reduce bonuses, you up incomes, which is what is happening right now, because you don't want to be able to be seen to be giving away these big bonuses, and you remunerate in different ways, and then ultimately it means that people aren't incentivized to chase that business, because it's not going to change your salary.
Yes, but you see, and you're right, of course. I mean, be a real catch, instead of the gazillions around, you landed up with a tenth of that. But it's also falling into the trap of assuming that only money motivates. And again, that is not the only criteria. We can think of lots of people who are deeply committed to causes or service delivery or the like. So it is falling into that trap. But for me, the added dimension of what Gavin's raising is when we set the criteria of success as a measure that can go awry. And here, if one thinks of the consulting industry and legal practices where billable hours is, what turns you into a hero, and then the temptation for that recognition is huge to just fudge the numbers a little bit.
Okay, but then we could go all the way back to our original story, which is around the liquidation industry, lawyers, banks, auctioneers, and they're all very, very buddy-buddy. Within a business, the same behaviours often exist because there isn't any kind of Chinese wall to say that this is how we should structure an incentive. I mean, how do you manage an incentive on the ground within a business that doesn't become a buddy-buddy system where I scratch your back and you'll help me reach my target?
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes down to systems and processes to a large extent. Where, there was that culture a long time ago in the financial services industry where you had brokers taking people to lunch and to places of ill repute, etc. and then there was this expectation that all the business would then be funneled back to those brokers. And that was very unethical, and very often that led to people paying brokerage fees that were out of line with the general market practice. And I think those kind of abuses have been taken away to a large extent in recent years, and it's specifically around proper systems and processes that you put in place in order to say, well, if we are going to pay brokerage, then it has to be along more objective lines in terms of fees, in terms of service levels, etc., And I think that's how you would go about solving it.
Cynthia, just to go back to your earlier comment, you said we assume that money is one of the most important incentives for people or motivations. What are the other aspects or motivational factors we should be looking at, and how can we build those into incentivization schemes?
You know, the big picture one is recognizing that the time we spend at work is in fact a really meaningful part of our lives. And certainly at a higher level, it's moving towards saying, can our work make a difference in any way? And there are many organizations that are tapping into that whole area of making a difference, whether it is with employee engagement schemes and community projects or the like. So it's not to suggest that money is, you know, has become irrelevant. I'm not saying that at all. But I do think certainly within the financial sector, there's been such an abundance of it for some people that it has skewed what is the value of a work-life balance at a point of time in your life when that would really suit your circumstances.
And it seems the Y generation or the younger generations are moving towards that and away from the money aspect of it.
You make a great point. That certainly is a shift in terms of how the younger generations are seeing it. And as I say, it is achieving a greater balance. But if the organization is solely pursuing profits, numbers, you know, money, then, you know, please let's not expect the employees to somehow miraculously have a different take on it.
Do you think it has a bit to do, and I know we've discussed this a bit before around the subject of you make a budget and then you aim for the budget issue. So, you know, organizations at the moment are running super lean. I mean, we've had retrenchments, businesses are tight, they're run by CFOs and numbers are checked week in, week out, are you on or off budget? But do you think what's happened then is that you've lost that culture of we actually contribute to something greater? Everybody is so absolutely thrilled by if you hit a target on your Excel spreadsheet, this is what your business stands for. I mean, I think that seems to be the culture that's coming through at the moment.
You make a really valid point. In fact, the 2013 Ernst & Young fraud survey has just come out, and they're really identifying that exactly around this issue of incentives. Yes, there is the obvious personal gain recognition, but in fact they're saying in terms of those results that much of the behavior is also being driven by literally trying to achieve really stretched, demanding business targets that in the current environment are not easily achievable.
So how do you do it though, Gavin? I mean, how do you turn around and take the situation where guys are driven to these targets that can't be reached? I mean, it's ultimately going to have the behavior where people are going to cut corners.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, firstly, obviously the primary solution is to set more realistic targets that people can achieve. They can be stretch targets, but not completely out of reach. Because once people don't see any way of reaching it legally, if you will, or ethically, then
it can be demotivating.
It's demotivating, and then almost the default behavior becomes the only way we're going to achieve it is if we do breach ethical protocols. You know, what you really want to do is also drive. Again, it comes back to systems and processes where if you've got appropriate management practices in place in order to develop people and what people can realistically achieve. Then that should feed ultimately into the incentive scheme at the same time.
I mean, we talked about, you know, other aspects that motivate people, but just from your experience in the industry, just if anything comes to mind in terms of some of the incentivization schemes that you've come across that really have worked well.
Do you know, one of the ones that works really well is recognition, and it's also completely free. That creating a system whereby people are recognized and it's specified. You know, we think, oh please, employee recognition schemes are the cheesiest thing in the universe. But in fact, most of us respond extremely well to recognition. And it's not ignoring the reward, but that real recognition for someone who paused to say, that was fabulous, what a great show, what a great article, whatever. In fact, we value it almost irrespective of where we are in the organization.
HBR came up with an article that also mentioned a good way
and of course Harvard Business.
A good way to motivate staff is also to show them how their work is impacting others and the difference they're making. So if you wrote an article and somebody responded with a letter to the magazine saying, wow, this really changed the way I approach my finances, then share that with the staff, because it's going to motivate them to keep writing insightful articles.
So, you know, it goes back to your point around the greater good and the greater value that you're adding in the world, I suppose. On a positive note there.
But it also makes good business sense. Yes, it is the greater good, but it also makes great business sense. I mean, if one were to look at your own behavior in terms of organizations you deal with, would you go with an organization that you trusted most? Would you go with a service provider that you knew would deliver a great product on time as specified? And in fact, it makes good business sense.
Yeah, and I think it does go through the organisation as well. I mean, I was also referencing a Harvard article here, but I mean, they were talking about call centres, and the idea is, you know, a call centre gets based on how many calls you answer, how many queries do you resolve as quickly as possible. Whereas if you look at it from the customer perspective, if the idea is just to be pushed through the meat grinder as fast as possible, I'm not exceeding customer service. I'm not looking after the customer. I'm simply serving the organisation's goals, which happen to be pump as many calls through the call centre.
Yes, absolutely.
I think that also comes back to the way people view call centres. You know, companies usually see call centres as a cost centre rather than a strategic asset to actually drive a positive customer experience.
And they don't represent the soul of the organisation.
Exactly.
They represent an easy way to, in fact, cut out the soul of the organisation to put it and incentivise people that way.
Yeah.
If we look at global companies who are getting this right, sort of the trusted brands, say a Nike or an Apple, who do you think we should be emulating locally?
Tough one.
do you know, I'm going to answer it with a question, which I know is not what you're looking for. I've often, when I've been speaking to large audiences, I've often said to them, can I ask you to name just 3 companies, let's assume operating in South Africa, whom you think have truly distinguished themselves as being ethical? Now, always say, look, I know I'm standing up here, but I'll see hands if you raise a hand. Do you know that the huge lack of response I get is not to suggest that there are no ethical companies, but I think companies aren't adequately truly distinguish themselves as being
But
ethical.
I do think that does play to the whole thing about US companies are very good at talking about their work culture.
Yes.
Google, Facebook,
Yes.
they talk. This is a good place to work.
Yes.
But the more you talk about it, the better it gets. And of course, the more you incentivize other companies to do that. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining.